March 15, 1945. The transport trucks rumbled through the muddy streets of Camp Siegburg, just outside the ruins of what had once been a thriving industrial town near the Rhine. Inside the canvas-covered vehicles, 43 German women sat in silence, their hands clasped together, their eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards. They had been told nothing, except that they were being transferred to a new facility. They had been captured 3 weeks earlier while working in a munitions factory that Allied forces had overrun during their rapid advance through Western Germany. Most were between 18 and 35 years old. They wore the same grey work dresses they had been wearing when captured, now stained with mud and sweat. Their faces were pale, their lips pressed into thin lines. They knew what awaited them, or at least they thought they knew. The propaganda they had absorbed for over a decade had prepared them for this moment. They had been told that the enemy soldiers, particularly those from America, were savages who would show no mercy to German prisoners. They had been told that certain soldiers, those with darker skin, were especially brutal, incapable of civilized behavior, driven by primitive instincts. They had been told that German women in particular would face unspeakable treatment at the hands of such men. As the trucks slowed and turned through the gates of their new detention facility, these women braced themselves for the horrors they had been conditioned to expect. What they would experience instead would shatter every assumption they had carried into captivity, and the transformation that followed would reveal truths about humanity that no amount of propaganda could suppress. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how compassion defeated ideology, how Sunday dinners became acts of resistance against hatred, and how 43 women discovered that the enemy they had been taught to fear were the very people who would show them the dignity they had been denied by their own government. The camp where they arrived was not what they had imagined. Camp Remagen had been established only weeks earlier, as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory. It was one of dozens of temporary detention facilities set up to process the overwhelming number of prisoners being captured as the German armed forces collapsed. The facility occupied what had been a textile factory before the conflict. The main building was a 3-story brick structure with large windows, many of them now broken and covered with boards. Surrounding the building was a fence of wire, hastily erected but secure. Guard towers stood at each corner, though they were little more than wooden platforms with canvas roofs. As the trucks came to a stop in the central courtyard, the women could hear voices outside speaking in English. The language sounded harsh to their ears, unfamiliar and threatening. The canvas flap at the back of the first truck was pulled aside, and daylight flooded in. A soldier appeared in the opening, his dark face silhouetted against the bright sky. Several women gasped, others began to cry softly. The soldier's name was Corporal James Washington, and he was 24 years old. He had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, the son of a sharecropper who had worked cotton fields for a white landowner. He had joined the army in 1942, believing that military service might earn him and others like him the respect and equal treatment they were denied at home. He had been assigned to the 684th Battalion, an all-black unit that had shipped to Europe in 1944. Like many black soldiers, he had been assigned to support duties rather than combat roles. His unit was responsible for guarding prisoners, managing supply lines, and performing the countless logistical tasks that kept armies moving. It was not the heroic combat role he had imagined when he enlisted, but he performed his duties with quiet dignity. Washington looked at the frightened faces of the women in the truck and felt a familiar weight in his chest. He had seen this look before, in the eyes of German soldiers when they first realized their captors would be black men. It was a look of terror mixed with disbelief, the product of years of indoctrination. He had learned not to take it personally, though it still stung every time. In a gentle voice, speaking slowly and clearly, Washington said, "Ladies, please step down from the truck. You will not be harmed. We are here to ensure your safety and provide for your needs. Please follow me to the registration area." Few of the women understood his words, but his tone was unmistakable. It was not harsh or commanding. It was almost apologetic. One by one, they climbed down from the truck, their legs stiff from the journey. They stood in a cluster, instinctively moving closer together for protection. Several more soldiers appeared, all of them black men in American uniforms. The women's terror was palpable. Private First Class Robert Johnson stepped forward with a clipboard. He was 22, from Detroit, where his father had worked in an automobile factory before the conflict. Johnson had attended 2 years of college before enlisting, making him one of the more educated men in the battalion. He had been assigned to administrative duties, which included processing new prisoners. He looked at the group of women and saw his own mother, his sisters, his neighbors. He saw human beings in distress, and it moved him deeply. Johnson spoke in halting German, which he had been learning from a phrasebook. His accent was terrible, but the effort was clear. Welcome. You safe. No harm. Food soon. Place to sleep. Clean water. The women stared at him in confusion. This was not the behavior they had been told to expect. Where was the brutality? Where were the threats and violence? Instead, they were being greeted with broken German and what appeared to be genuine concern. Sergeant William Thompson was the ranking non-commissioned officer on duty that day. He was 28 years old and had been in the army longer than most of his men. He had served in North Africa and Italy before being transferred to the 684th Battalion. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing in appearance, but his demeanor was calm and measured. He had learned through experience that the best way to manage prisoners was through consistent, humane treatment. Fear and cruelty only created problems. Respect and basic decency made everything easier. Thompson addressed the women through an interpreter, a German-speaking soldier from another unit who had been assigned to assist. "Ladies, my name is Sergeant Thompson. You are now prisoners under the protection of the United States Army. You will be treated according to international agreements regarding prisoners. You will be given food, water, medical care, and shelter. You will be expected to follow the rules of this facility, but you will not be mistreated. Do you understand?" The interpreter translated, and the women nodded silently. They did not believe him. How could they? Everything they had been taught suggested this was a trick, a way to lull them into false security before the real horrors began. The registration process took several hours. Each woman was assigned a number, though the soldiers also made careful note of their names. They were asked basic questions about their health, their work before capture, and whether they had any immediate medical needs. Several women were suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. One had an infected wound on her hand from factory machinery. Another was in the early stages of pneumonia. Thompson immediately sent these women to the camp's medical facility, a converted office space where an army doctor and 2 medics provided basic care. The doctor, Captain Marcus Williams, was a black physician from Philadelphia who had graduated from Howard University Medical School. He had faced enormous barriers to becoming a doctor, both from the racism of American society and from the military's initial reluctance to commission black medical officers. But he had persevered, and now he found himself treating former enemy prisoners with the same care he would have given to American soldiers. To Williams, medicine transcended politics and propaganda. Every patient deserved competent, compassionate care. When the woman with the infected hand was brought to him, she recoiled in fear. Williams noticed her reaction and spoke softly to the interpreter. "Please tell her that I am a doctor, that I am going to clean and bandage her wound, and that it will hurt a little, but I will be as gentle as possible. Tell her she is safe." The interpreter conveyed the message, and the woman reluctantly extended her hand. Williams worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with antiseptic, applying sulfur powder to fight infection, and wrapping it in clean gauze. His touch was careful and professional. When he finished, he smiled at her and said through the interpreter, "Keep it clean and dry. Come back in 3 days so I can check it. You will be fine." The woman looked at her bandaged hand and then at Williams. Tears began to stream down her face. She whispered something in German. The interpreter translated, "She says thank you. She says she does not understand." Williams nodded. "Tell her she is welcome. Tell her that all people deserve medical care, regardless of who they are or where they come from." After registration and medical screening, the women were taken to their quarters. The camp housed male and female prisoners in separate buildings. The women's section was on the 2nd floor of the main structure, where the old textile factory's administrative offices had been. The rooms had been cleared of furniture and equipped with cots, blankets, and basic amenities. It was sparse but clean. The windows, though barred, let in natural light. Each room housed 6 to 8 women. As the women settled into their assigned spaces, they spoke in hushed tones, sharing their confusion and fear. One woman, whose name was Greta Hoffman, had been a supervisor at the munitions factory. She was 31 years old, married to a soldier who had not been heard from in months. She had a 6-year-old daughter who was staying with relatives in a village that may or may not still existed. Greta had been a loyal supporter of the government, believing deeply in the cause for which her country fought. She had volunteered to work in the factory, seeing it as her duty to support the troops. Now she was a prisoner, surrounded by the very people she had been taught to hate and fear. Greta spoke to the other women in her room. "Stay together. Do not trust them. This kindness is a deception. They want us to let our guard down. Remember what we were told. Remember who they are." But even as she spoke these words, doubt gnawed at her. The soldiers' behavior did not match the propaganda. Their voices were gentle. Their actions were respectful. The medical care had been genuine. It did not make sense. Another woman, Anna Schneider, was only 19 years old. She had worked in the factory for less than a year, having been conscripted from her village to support the effort. Anna had never been political. She had simply done what she was told, as most young people did. But she had absorbed the messages of the propaganda through school, through the radio, through posters and films. She knew what she was supposed to believe about the enemy, especially about black soldiers. Yet her experience in the past few hours contradicted everything she had been taught. Anna spoke quietly. "What if they truly mean us no harm? What if we were lied to?" Greta turned to her sharply. "Do not be naive. This is a test of our resolve. They want us to forget who we are, to betray our country. We must remain strong." But strength was becoming harder to maintain as the days passed, and the expected brutality never materialized. The soldiers of the 684th Battalion had their own challenges. They were acutely aware of the irony of their situation. They had been sent to fight for freedom and democracy in Europe while being denied those very things at home. In the American South, where most of them came from, they could not vote, could not eat in the same restaurants as white people, could not use the same schools or hospitals. They faced violence and intimidation simply for the color of their skin. Yet here they were, thousands of miles from home, guarding prisoners and trying to demonstrate the values their own country often failed to uphold. Corporal Washington spoke about this with his fellow soldiers one evening as they sat in their quarters, a converted warehouse near the main camp. "It is strange, is it not? These women have been taught to hate us, to see us as less than human, just like people back home see us. But here we have the power. We could treat them the way we are treated. We could be cruel, and no one would stop us. But we choose differently." "Why is that?" Private Johnson answered thoughtfully. "Because we know what it feels like. We know what it is like to be seen as less than human. We would not wish that on anyone, not even our enemies. Maybe that is what makes us better than those who oppress us. We choose kindness even when we have been shown cruelty." Sergeant Thompson, who was listening to the conversation, added his perspective. "It is also practical. If we treat them well, they cooperate. They cause no trouble. They begin to see us as human beings, and we can see them the same way. Hatred only breeds more hatred. Respect breeds respect. It is a simple equation." But there was more to it than practicality. Many of the soldiers felt a genuine desire to prove the propaganda wrong, to show that they were capable of the very civilization and morality that had been denied to them by the ideology they were fighting against. Every act of kindness was a form of resistance against the racism they faced, both from the enemy and from their own society. The first Sunday after the women's arrival was a turning point. In the black communities where these soldiers had grown up, Sunday was special. It was a day of rest, of church, of family gatherings, and of food. Sunday dinner was an institution, a time when families came together to share a meal that was more elaborate than the everyday fare. The tradition had roots in African American culture that stretched back generations, a way of preserving community and dignity even in the face of oppression. Several of the soldiers, led by Corporal Washington and Private Johnson, decided they wanted to share this tradition with the prisoners. They approached Sergeant Thompson with their idea. Washington explained, "Sergeant, we have been talking and we want to do something special for the prisoners this Sunday. We want to cook them a real Sunday dinner, the kind our mothers and grandmothers used to make. Fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, sweet potato pie. We have access to the ingredients through the supply chain. We can use our own rations if needed. We think it would make a difference." Thompson considered the proposal. It was unusual, certainly. Army regulations required that prisoners be fed, but there was no requirement that the food be anything more than basic sustenance. What the men were proposing was something else entirely, an act of cultural sharing, of hospitality, of human connection. It could be seen as fraternizing with the enemy. But Thompson understood the deeper purpose. He approved the plan. The soldiers spent Saturday preparing. They requisitioned chickens from the supply depot, along with flour, buttermilk, and spices. They gathered collard greens, onions, and ham hocks. They obtained cornmeal, eggs, and butter. For the sweet potato pie, they managed to find canned sweet potatoes, sugar, and evaporated milk. It was not exactly like home, but it would be close enough. The cooking took place in the camp's kitchen, a large space with industrial stoves and ovens. The soldiers worked together, sharing techniques their mothers and grandmothers had taught them. Washington seasoned the chicken with salt, pepper, paprika, and a touch of cayenne, just as his mother had done. He dredged each piece in seasoned flour and carefully lowered them into hot oil, watching as the coating turned golden brown and crispy. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and savory and utterly unfamiliar to the German women who caught the scent drifting through the building. Johnson prepared the collard greens, washing each leaf carefully, removing the tough stems and chopping them into manageable pieces. He sautéed onions in a large pot, added the greens, poured in chicken broth, and nestled ham hocks among the leaves to flavor them as they simmered. It would take hours for the greens to become tender and flavorful, but the wait would be worth it. Another soldier, Private Lewis from Mississippi, made the cornbread. He mixed cornmeal with flour, baking powder, salt, sugar, eggs, buttermilk, and melted butter, creating a thick batter that he poured into greased pans. The cornbread would bake until it was golden on top with crispy edges, soft and slightly sweet inside. The sweet potato pies required the most finesse. Private Davis, who had learned baking from his grandmother, mixed the sweet potato puree with eggs, sugar, evaporated milk, vanilla, cinnamon, and nutmeg. He poured the filling into pie crusts and baked them until they were set, with a slight jiggle in the center that would firm up as they cooled. The aroma of cinnamon and sweet potato filled the air, a scent that spoke of home and comfort and love. By Sunday morning, everything was ready. The soldiers set up tables in the courtyard where the women took their meals. They brought out the food on large platters and in serving bowls, arranging it carefully. The presentation was simple but thoughtful. They wanted the women to know that this meal was special. That effort had been made on their behalf. When the women were called to lunch, they emerged from their quarters with the usual wariness. They expected the standard rations they had been receiving, bread, soup, perhaps some cheese or sausage. What they saw instead made them stop in their tracks. The tables were laden with food unlike anything they had seen in years. The fried chicken piled high on platters glistened with oil and seasoning. The collard greens, dark and tender, steamed in large bowls. The cornbread cut into squares sat in baskets lined with cloth. The sweet potato pies, sliced and ready to serve, waited on the side. The women looked at each other in confusion. What was this? Why were they being given such food? Sergeant Thompson stood before them and spoke through the interpreter. "Ladies, today is Sunday, which is a special day for us. In our communities, Sunday is a day for family, for rest, and for sharing a meal together. The soldiers of this battalion wanted to share that tradition with you. This food is called soul food, and it comes from our culture. We hope you enjoy it." The women hesitated. Was this some kind of trick? Was the food poisoned? But the soldiers were already serving themselves from the same platters, eating the same food. It was not poisoned. It was genuine. Slowly, the women began to fill their plates. They sat at the tables and took their first bites. The flavors were unlike anything they had experienced. The fried chicken was crispy on the outside, juicy and tender inside, seasoned with spices they could not identify but found delicious. The collard greens were rich and savory, with a smokiness from the ham hocks and a slight bitterness balanced by the broth. The cornbread was sweet and moist, crumbling slightly in their mouths. The sweet potato pie was like a dessert from a dream, creamy and spiced and comforting. For many of the women, it was the first truly satisfying meal they had eaten in months, perhaps years. The latter years of the conflict had brought severe shortages to Germany. Rations had been reduced again and again. Many families had been surviving on bread, potatoes, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat had become a rare luxury. Sugar and butter were nearly impossible to obtain. The munitions factory where these women had worked provided a daily ration, but it was meager and tasteless. And since their capture, they had been eating army rations that were nutritionally adequate but utterly bland. This Sunday dinner was something else entirely. It was abundance, it was flavor, it was care. As the women ate, they began to talk among themselves, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger. Some were crying, though they tried to hide it. Others were smiling, perhaps for the first time since their capture. The food was breaking down barriers that fear and propaganda had erected. Greta Hoffmann sat at one of the tables, a piece of fried chicken in her hand, tears streaming down her face. She had not cried since her capture, determined to maintain her composure and her loyalty. But this act of unexpected kindness had broken through her defenses. She thought of her daughter, of the meals they had shared before the conflict had consumed everything. She thought of her husband, wherever he was, and wondered if he was being shown the same compassion she was experiencing. She thought of everything she had believed, everything she had been told, and felt those beliefs crumbling. Anna Schneider, the young woman who had questioned the propaganda earlier, sat next to Greta. She was eating the sweet potato pie, savoring each bite. She looked up and saw Corporal Washington standing nearby, watching the women with a gentle expression. On impulse, Anna stood and approached him. She did not speak English, but she held out her plate and pointed to the pie, then placed her hand over her heart. The gesture was clear. "Thank you, from the heart." Washington smiled and nodded. "You are welcome," he said softly, even though she could not understand his words. The Sunday dinners became a regular occurrence. Every week the soldiers prepared a special meal for the prisoners. Sometimes it was fried chicken again. Other times it was barbecued ribs or roasted pork or smothered steak. There were always greens of some kind, collards or mustard greens or turnip greens. There was always cornbread or biscuits. There was always dessert, whether pie or cake or cobbler. The soldiers took pride in their cooking, competing good-naturedly to see who could make the best dish. But more than the food itself, it was the spirit behind it that mattered. The soldiers were sharing a piece of their culture, their history, their identity. They were saying, without words, "We are human beings with rich traditions and deep connections. We are not the savages you were told about. We are men of dignity and culture, and we see you as human beings too, deserving of the same respect and care we would want for ourselves." The women began to respond in kind. As the weeks passed and the spring of 1945 turned toward summer, the barriers between captors and captives continued to break down. The women started to learn a few words of English. The soldiers improved their German. Conversations became possible, tentative at first, but growing more comfortable over time. One afternoon, Anna Schneider approached Private Johnson during a break in the daily routine. She had been working on her English, practicing with the other women, and she wanted to try speaking with one of the soldiers. She found Johnson reading a book outside the administrative building. In halting English, she said, "Thank you. For food. For kindness." Johnson looked up, surprised and pleased. "You are very welcome. Your English is good." Anna shook her head. "No, no good. But I try." They talked for a few minutes, a mixture of English, German, and hand gestures. Anna asked where Johnson was from, and he told her about Detroit, about the automobile factories, about his family. She told him about her village, about her life before the conflict, about her hopes for the future. It was a simple conversation, the kind of exchange that happened between people everywhere. But in this context, it was revolutionary. Word of the interaction spread among both the prisoners and the soldiers. More conversations followed. The women began to ask questions about America, about the soldiers' lives, about their families. The soldiers asked similar questions in return. They discovered shared human experiences, the love of family, the desire for peace, the hope for a better future. They found common ground in music, in laughter, in the small joys that transcended nationality and ideology. Greta Hoffmann remained more resistant than most. Her loyalty to the former ideology ran deep, and she struggled with the cognitive dissonance between what she had believed and what she was experiencing. But even she could not deny the evidence before her eyes. These men, whom she had been taught to fear and despise, were treating her with more dignity and respect than her own government had shown in the final years of the conflict. They were feeding her, caring for her health, speaking to her with courtesy. They asked nothing in return except that she follow the basic rules of the camp. One Sunday evening, after another exceptional meal, Greta found herself sitting alone in the courtyard as the sun set. Sergeant Thompson happened to walk by and noticed her. He paused and asked through an interpreter who was nearby, "Are you well, ma'am? Is there anything you need?" Greta looked up at him, this tall black man in an American uniform, and felt a wave of emotion she could not suppress. She spoke in German, and the interpreter translated, "I do not understand. Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemies. Our country has caused so much suffering. We have been told that people like you are, I cannot even say the words now, because I know they are lies. But we believed those lies. We supported a government that spread those lies. We do not deserve your kindness." Thompson listened carefully as the interpreter conveyed her words. He thought for a moment before responding. "Ma'am, I will tell you what I believe. I believe that every person has dignity, no matter who they are or what they have done. I believe that hatred only creates more hatred, and that the only way to break that cycle is through compassion. I also believe that you are not your government. You are a person who was caught up in something larger than yourself, just like all of us. You are a prisoner now, but you are still a human being, and you deserve to be treated as such." The interpreter translated, and Greta absorbed his words. She nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "I have a daughter," she said. "She is 6 years old. I do not know if she is alive, if our village still stands, if my family survived. I think of her every day. I wonder what world she will grow up in, if she will have a future. And I realize now that if she is alive, I want her to grow up in a world more like what you have shown me here. A world where people treat each other with respect, regardless of differences. A world where kindness is stronger than hate." Thompson's expression softened. "I hope your daughter is safe, ma'am. I hope all of this ends soon, and you can be reunited with her. I hope she grows up in the world you described. That is what we are fighting for, even if the fight is not always clear." Greta wiped her eyes and looked at Thompson with something approaching admiration. "You are a good man, Sergeant, better than many I have known. I am sorry for everything. I am sorry for the hate I carried. I am sorry for what my country has done. I cannot change the past, but perhaps I can learn from it." Thompson nodded. "We all have things to learn, ma'am. I have learned much from this experience too. I have learned that people are capable of change, that understanding can grow even in the most unlikely circumstances. That gives me hope." As the weeks turned into months and spring gave way to summer, the camp at Remagen became a small island of unexpected harmony in a world torn apart by conflict. The relationship between the soldiers and the prisoners continued to evolve. The women no longer feared their guards. Instead, they looked forward to interactions with them. They exchanged stories, shared jokes, and even sang songs together. The soldiers taught the women American folk songs and spirituals. The women taught the soldiers German folk songs and traditional melodies. Music became a bridge between cultures, a universal language that needed no translation. The soldiers also organized other activities to help the women pass the time and maintain their dignity. They set up a small library with books in German that had been salvaged from various sources. They provided materials for sewing and crafts, allowing the women to occupy their hands and minds. They arranged for the women to write letters to their families, though it was unclear if those letters would reach their destinations given the chaos in Germany. Nevertheless, the act of writing gave the women hope and a sense of connection to the world beyond the camp. One of the most significant developments was the informal education that took place. Several of the soldiers were well-educated men who had attended college or had been teachers before the conflict. They began offering lessons to the women who were interested, teaching them English and sharing knowledge about American history, culture, and society. The women, in turn, shared their own knowledge and experiences. These exchanges were enlightening for both groups. Private Johnson, who had been a university student, was particularly active in these educational efforts. He would sit with small groups of women and discuss literature, philosophy, and politics. He spoke honestly about the challenges and contradictions of America, including the racism and inequality that existed there. He did not present his country as perfect, but rather as a place that was striving, however imperfectly, toward ideals of freedom and justice. Anna Schneider became one of Johnson's most eager students. She attended every session he offered, absorbing information like a sponge. She began to read the books in the camp's small library, particularly those about democracy, human rights, and social justice. She was discovering ideas that had been suppressed or distorted by the propaganda she had been exposed to all her life. She realized how much had been hidden from her, how much she had been manipulated. The realization was both painful and liberating. One day, Anna asked Johnson a question that had been troubling her. "Private Johnson, how is it that you can be so kind to us, after everything? Your country is at war with mine. We have caused so much death and suffering, and beyond that I know that your own country does not treat you fairly. You have told us about the segregation, the discrimination, the violence you face at home. How can you still believe in goodness, in treating others with respect? How are you not filled with bitterness?" Johnson considered her question carefully. It was not the first time he had been asked this, but it still required thought. "Anna, I will not lie to you. I do feel bitterness sometimes. I feel anger at the injustice I have experienced, and that my people continue to experience. But I have also learned that bitterness and anger, if allowed to consume you, will destroy you. They will make you into something you do not want to be. My mother used to tell me that the measure of a person is not what they do when it is easy, but what they do when it is hard. It is easy to be kind to those who are kind to you. It is easy to show respect to those who respect you, but to show kindness and respect to those who have been taught to hate you, to those who are your enemies, that is hard. That is the real test of character." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I also believe that change is possible. I have seen it here in this camp. You and the other women came here believing we were monsters. Now we are having this conversation as friends. If that kind of change is possible, then other change is possible too. Maybe one day the racism in my own country will change. Maybe one day people everywhere will learn to see past the color of skin, past nationality, past all the things that divide us. I have to believe that, because without that belief, what is the point of any of this?" Anna listened intently, and when he finished, she nodded slowly. "You are right. Change is possible. I am proof of that. My beliefs have changed completely in just a few months. I thought I knew the truth, but I was living in a lie. Now I see things differently. When I go home, if I have a home to go to, I will try to help others see what I have learned. I will tell them about the men I met here, about the kindness you showed us. I will tell them that we were wrong about so many things." Similar transformations were happening throughout the camp. Women who had arrived frightened and indoctrinated were leaving with fundamentally altered worldviews. They had seen through direct personal experience that the propaganda was false. They had been treated with humanity by the very people they had been taught to dehumanize, and that experience could not be erased or explained away. The soldiers too were changed by the experience. Many of them had arrived in Europe carrying their own prejudices and assumptions. They had expected German prisoners to be hardened ideologues, committed to their cause until the end. They had expected resistance and hostility. Instead, they found ordinary people who had been caught up in extraordinary circumstances, people who were capable of growth and change when shown a different way. Corporal Washington spoke about this in a letter to his mother back in Birmingham. He wrote, "Mama, I wish I could describe to you what I have witnessed here. We are guarding German women who were captured working in a factory. When they first arrived, they were terrified of us. They had been told we were savages, that we would hurt them, but we have shown them kindness. The kind of kindness you taught me. We cook for them on Sundays, making the same food you used to make for our family. We treat them with respect and dignity. And Mama, you should see how they have changed. They smile now. They talk with us. They are learning English and we are learning German. They are beginning to see us as human beings and we see them the same way. I think about this a lot. If these women who were raised to hate us can learn to see past that hate, then maybe there is hope for the world. Maybe there is hope even for places like Birmingham. Maybe one day, people there will learn to see us as human beings too, deserving of the same respect and dignity as anyone else. That is my prayer. As the summer of 1945 progressed, the conflict in Europe drew to its conclusion. Germany formally surrendered in May, and the infrastructure of the government began to collapse. The camps like Remagen faced new challenges as the number of prisoners swelled and resources became strained. But the soldiers of the 684th Battalion maintained their commitment to humane treatment, even as conditions became more difficult. In late July, word came that the women at Camp Remagen would be released. The military had determined that female civilian prisoners who had not been directly involved in combat and who posed no security threat would be allowed to return to their homes, or to what remained of their homes. The news was met with mixed emotions. The women were eager to reunite with their families, to find out what had become of their loved ones and their communities. But they also felt a sense of sadness at leaving the camp. It had become, in a strange way, a place of safety and transformation. Many of the women had formed genuine friendships with the soldiers who guarded them, and the parting would be difficult. On the final Sunday before their release, the soldiers prepared one last special meal. It was the most elaborate yet, with every dish they could manage to prepare given the limited resources. There was fried chicken, roasted pork, barbecued ribs, collard greens, green beans, cornbread, biscuits, mashed potatoes, gravy, and an array of desserts including sweet potato pie, peach cobbler, and pound cake. It was a feast, a celebration, and a farewell all at once. The meal was served in the courtyard on a warm summer evening. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the scene. The soldiers and the prisoners sat together at the tables, the boundaries between captor and captive having long since dissolved. They ate and talked and laughed, sharing stories and memories of the past months. Some of the women sang German songs, and the soldiers responded with spirituals and folk tunes. It was a moment of pure human connection, transcending the conflict that had brought them together. Sergeant Thompson stood and raised his glass of water. He waited for the conversations to quiet, then spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow these women will begin their journey home. It has been our privilege to serve as their guardians during these past months. We have learned much from them, and I hope they have learned something from us as well. We came from different worlds, spoke different languages, and were on opposite sides of a terrible conflict. But we discovered that beneath all those differences, we are fundamentally the same. We all want peace, safety, family, and a chance to build a good life. We all have the capacity for kindness and cruelty, for love and hate. What we choose to act upon defines who we are." He paused, looking around at the faces gathered before him. "I hope that when these women return to their homes, they will carry with them the memory of this place and the friendships formed here. I hope they will tell others what they experienced, and that perhaps those stories will help heal some of the wounds of this conflict. And I hope that we, as soldiers, will carry these memories as well, and will continue to treat all people with the dignity and respect they deserve, whether they are enemies or friends." The interpreter translated Thompson's words, and when she finished there was a moment of silence. Then Greta Hoffmann stood. She had asked earlier if she could speak on behalf of the women, and Thompson had agreed. She spoke in German, her voice steady and clear, and the interpreter translated for the soldiers. "Sergeant Thompson, Corporal Washington, Private Johnson and all the men of this battalion, we came here as your enemies. We arrived filled with fear and hatred, believing the lies we had been told about you. We expected the worst, and we would not have blamed you if you had given us exactly that. You had every reason to be cruel. We were representatives of a government that had caused immense suffering, that had spread a poisonous ideology, that had treated people as less than human based on their race, their religion, their nationality. You had every right to hate us." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "But you did not hate us. You fed us. You cared for us. You treated us with kindness and respect. You shared your culture with us, your food, your music, your stories. You saw us not as enemies, but as people. You showed us what true humanity looks like, and in doing so you destroyed the lies we had believed. You proved that everything we had been taught was false. You showed us that character is not determined by the color of skin, or by nationality, or by any external factor. It is determined by how we treat each other, especially when it would be easier to do otherwise." Tears were flowing freely down her face now, and many of the other women were crying as well. "I speak for all of us when I say that we will never forget what you have done for us. We will carry these lessons for the rest of our lives. We will tell our children and grandchildren about the black soldiers who showed us mercy when we deserved none. We will do everything in our power to fight against hatred and prejudice, because we have seen firsthand where those things lead and what they cost. You have given us more than food and shelter. You have given us a second chance, a chance to be better than we were, to build a better future. For that, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts." When the interpreter finished translating Greta's words, there was not a dry eye in the courtyard. The soldiers stood and applauded, and the women joined them. The sound echoed off the brick walls of the old textile factory, a sound of unity and shared humanity in a place that had been designed to separate and confine. The next morning, the women prepared to leave. They gathered their few belongings and assembled in the courtyard where they had shared so many meals. Army trucks had arrived to transport them to a processing center where they would receive temporary papers and assistance in returning to their homes. The soldiers formed a line to say goodbye, shaking hands with each woman, offering words of encouragement and farewell. When Anna Schneider reached Private Johnson, she paused. She had prepared something to say in English, practicing the pronunciation carefully. "Private Johnson, thank you for teaching me. Thank you for showing me new world. I will not forget. I will be better person because of you." Johnson smiled, though his eyes were moist with tears. "Anna, you were always a good person. You just needed the chance to see things clearly. I have no doubt you will do great things with your life. Take care of yourself and never stop learning, never stop questioning, never stop growing." They embraced briefly, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Then Anna moved on, and the next woman stepped forward. When Greta Hoffman reached Sergeant Thompson, she held out her hand. He took it in both of his, holding it gently. "Sergeant Thompson," she said through the interpreter who stood nearby. "I told you once that I hoped my daughter would grow up in a world like the one you created here. If she is alive, if I find her, I will raise her to embody the values you have shown me. I will teach her that every person deserves respect, that kindness is strength, and that we must always question what we are told and seek the truth for ourselves. You have given me a gift beyond measure, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." Thompson nodded, deeply moved. "Mrs. Hoffman, you are already worthy. You had the courage to question everything you had been taught, to change your beliefs in the face of new evidence. That takes tremendous strength. I wish you all the best in finding your daughter and rebuilding your life. May you find peace and happiness." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, two people from vastly different worlds who had found common ground in the most unlikely of places. Then Greta climbed into the truck with the other women, and the vehicles began to pull away. The soldiers stood and watched until the trucks disappeared from view. Then slowly they dispersed to return to their duties, but the experience would stay with them forever. In the weeks and months that followed, the soldiers of the 684th Battalion continued their duties in occupied Germany. They managed other prison facilities, assisted with logistics, and helped with the enormous task of rebuilding a shattered nation. But the experience with the women of Camp Remagen remained a touchstone, a reminder of why they had come to Europe and what they were fighting for. When the war ended completely and the soldiers began returning home, they carried these memories with them. They returned to an America that was still deeply segregated, where black men and women faced discrimination and violence daily. The victory over fascism abroad had not translated into victory over racism at home, but these soldiers had seen that change was possible, that people could overcome their prejudices when confronted with truth and kindness. That knowledge sustained them as they fought new battles, the battles for civil rights and equality in their own country. Many of the soldiers became involved in the civil rights movement that would transform America in the decades following the conflict. They drew on their experiences in Europe to argue that if enemies could learn to respect each other, surely fellow citizens could do the same. They spoke at churches and community centers, telling the story of Camp Remagen and the women who had learned to see past propaganda and hate. Their stories inspired others to continue the fight for justice and equality. Corporal James Washington returned to Birmingham and became a teacher. He taught history and civics, using his experiences to show his students that people are not defined by race or nationality, but by their actions and choices. He spoke often about the Sunday dinners at Camp Remagen, about the power of sharing food and culture to bridge divides. Many of his students went on to become leaders in the civil rights movement, carrying forward the lessons he had taught them. Private Robert Johnson returned to Detroit and finished his college education. He became a social worker, dedicating his life to helping others. He often thought about Anna Schneider and wondered what had become of her. He hoped she had survived and had found a way to build a good life. He hoped she had kept her promise to be a better person, to fight against hatred and prejudice. He believed she had, because he had seen the transformation in her and knew it was genuine. Sergeant William Thompson remained in the Army for several more years before retiring and returning to civilian life. He became a minister, leading a church in Atlanta and preaching about reconciliation, forgiveness, and the shared humanity of all people. He often told the story of Camp Remagen from the pulpit, using it to illustrate the Christian values of love and compassion for enemies. His congregation grew and became a center of civil rights activism, a place where black and white people came together to work for change. As for the women of Camp Remagen, their stories took many paths. Some returned to villages that no longer existed, their families lost in the chaos of the conflict's final months. They had to rebuild their lives from nothing, a daunting task in a country devastated by conflict and occupation. But they carried with them the lessons they had learned. The knowledge that people could choose kindness over cruelty, that change was possible. Others, like Greta Hoffmann, were fortunate enough to be reunited with their families. Greta found her daughter alive and well, staying with relatives in a rural area that had been spared the worst of the devastation. The reunion was joyful beyond words. Greta held her daughter and wept, grateful for a second chance she had never expected to receive. As her daughter grew older, Greta kept her promise to Sergeant Thompson. She taught her child about respect, tolerance, and the importance of questioning authority. She told her the story of the black soldiers who had shown them mercy, who had fed them and cared for them and treated them with dignity. Her daughter grew up with these values and passed them on to her own children, creating a ripple effect that extended across generations. Anna Schneider returned to her village and found it largely intact, though many of its young men had not returned. She took a job as a teacher, determined to educate the next generation differently than she had been educated. She taught her students to think critically, to question what they were told, to seek out diverse perspectives. She spoke openly about her experiences as a prisoner, about the soldiers who had changed her life. Some in the community criticized her for this, accusing her of being sympathetic to the enemy. But Anna refused to be silenced. She knew that only by confronting the past honestly could Germany build a better future. In later years, Anna wrote a memoir about her experiences. The book was titled The Sunday Dinners: How Enemy Soldiers Taught Me About Humanity. It was published in German in 1962 and became a modest success, read primarily by younger Germans who were grappling with their country's history and seeking to understand how such terrible things had been allowed to happen. Anna's story provided a personal perspective, showing how propaganda and indoctrination could warp perceptions, but also how direct human contact and kindness could break through those distortions. The book was later translated into English and found a new audience in America, particularly among black readers who were moved by the story of the 684th Battalion. Some of the surviving soldiers were contacted by readers who wanted to thank them or hear more about their experiences. These connections led to reunions and ongoing friendships, as soldiers and former prisoners who had not seen each other in decades reconnected and shared their lives' journeys. In 1975, 30 years after the end of the conflict, a remarkable event took place. A group of the surviving women from Camp Remagen organized a reunion with the surviving soldiers of the 684th Battalion. The gathering was held in New York City at a hotel in Manhattan. It was a small event, attended by perhaps 20 women and 30 men, along with their families. But it was deeply meaningful. The attendees were older now, in their 50s and 60s, with grey hair and lined faces. But when they saw each other, the years fell away. They embraced like old friends, which in truth they were. They shared photographs and stories, catching each other up on the intervening decades. They introduced their children and grandchildren, the next generation, who carried forward the legacy of that remarkable time. During the reunion, a special dinner was held. In honor of the Sunday dinners that had meant so much, the organizers arranged for a traditional soul food meal to be prepared. There was fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and sweet potato pie, just like the meals shared 3 decades earlier in a prison camp in Germany. As the attendees ate, many were overcome with emotion, remembering that time when kindness had triumphed over hatred, when enemies had become friends. Greta Hoffmann, now in her 60s, stood to speak. Her daughter sat beside her, and her granddaughter, a young woman in her 20s, sat next to her daughter. 3 generations, all present because of the mercy shown by the men in this room. 30 years ago, Greta began, I was a different person. I was filled with fear and hatred, believing lies about people I had never met. Then I met you, the soldiers of the 684th Battalion, and you showed me a different way. You fed me when I was hungry. You cared for me when I was ill. You treated me with respect when I had done nothing to deserve it. You changed my life, and not just my life, but the lives of my daughter and granddaughter as well. The values you taught me have been passed down through my family. We will never forget what you did for us, and we will always be grateful. Sergeant Thompson, now Reverend Thompson, stood to respond. Mrs. Hoffman, the gratitude should go both ways. You and the other women taught us something equally important. You taught us that people are capable of change, that understanding can overcome prejudice, that there is always hope for reconciliation and peace. Those lessons have sustained us through difficult times. They have guided us in our work for justice and equality. You were part of our journey, just as we were part of yours. The reunion was covered by several newspapers and a local television station. The story of the Sunday dinners at Camp Remagen reached a wider audience, inspiring people with its message of compassion and redemption. It became a frequently cited example in discussions about reconciliation, about how former enemies could find common ground, about the power of treating others with dignity, even in the midst of conflict. In the years that followed, the story continued to resonate. Historians researched the 684th Battalion and the camps they had managed, documenting the experiences of both the soldiers and the prisoners. Academic papers were written analyzing the dynamics of the relationships formed, exploring how kindness and cultural exchange could break down prejudice. The story was included in textbooks and taught in schools, offered as a counterpoint to the darkness of the conflict, a reminder that even in the worst of times, individuals could choose to act with humanity. The soldiers and the women who had been at Camp Remagen continued to stay in touch over the years. They exchanged letters and holiday cards. They celebrated each other's milestones and mourned each other's losses. When one of the soldiers passed away, the women who had known him would send flowers and condolences to the family. When one of the women died, the soldiers would attend memorial services if possible, or send tributes celebrating the person's life and the impact she had made. As the decades passed and the generation that had lived through the conflict began to fade, the stories they told took on new urgency. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the soldiers and the prisoners became the keepers of these memories, recognizing their importance in an increasingly divided world. They created websites and social media accounts dedicated to sharing the story. They gave talks at schools and community organizations. They worked to ensure that the lessons of Camp Remagen would not be forgotten. The legacy of the Sunday dinners extended beyond just the individuals directly involved. The story influenced military policy and training regarding the treatment of prisoners. It was cited in discussions about the Geneva Conventions and the importance of humane treatment even in conflict. It provided a powerful example of how following ethical principles, even when not required to do so, could have profound positive effects. The story also resonated in the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. The soldiers of the 684th Battalion had shown remarkable character in treating their former enemies with kindness, despite facing discrimination and injustice in their own country. Their example inspired later generations of activists who fought for civil rights, demonstrating that moral authority comes from living one's values consistently, even when it is difficult. The Sunday dinners at Camp Remagen became a symbol of the possibility of reconciliation and understanding across even the deepest divides. In a world that often seemed determined to emphasize differences and conflicts between groups, this story offered a different vision, one in which people could see past propaganda and prejudice to recognize their shared humanity. The food itself, the soul food that the soldiers had shared with the prisoners, took on symbolic meaning. It represented not just physical nourishment, but emotional and spiritual nourishment as well. It represented the sharing of culture and identity, the willingness to be vulnerable and authentic with those who might have been enemies. The recipes that had been passed down from mothers and grandmothers, the traditional dishes that carried the history and resilience of African American communities, had become instruments of peace and transformation. In the years since, whenever people gathered to discuss reconciliation or peacemaking or bridging divides, the story of Camp Remagen was often invoked. It became a reminder that individuals have agency, that we can choose how to treat others regardless of the context in which we find ourselves. The soldiers could have followed the example of cruelty and dehumanization set by the ideology they were fighting against. Instead, they chose a different path, one rooted in the values they had learned from their families and communities, values of hospitality, generosity, and seeing the humanity in everyone. The women of Camp Remagen, for their part, demonstrated the possibility of transformation. They showed that people who have been indoctrinated with hateful beliefs are not beyond redemption, that when confronted with truth and kindness, they are capable of profound change. Their willingness to question their beliefs, to acknowledge that they had been wrong and to commit to being different moving forward, offered hope that even the most deeply entrenched prejudices could be overcome. The story also highlighted the often overlooked contributions of black soldiers during World War II. For too long, the narrative of the conflict had focused primarily on white soldiers, ignoring or minimizing the significant roles played by black men and women in uniform. The soldiers of the 684th Battalion and other black units served their country with distinction, often in support roles that were essential to the success of military operations. They faced discrimination within the military itself, with segregated units and limited opportunities for advancement. Yet they performed their duties with professionalism and dignity. The Sunday dinners at Camp Remagen revealed the character of these men in a way that combat stories might not have. They showed intelligence, creativity, compassion, and cultural sophistication. They demonstrated leadership and moral courage. They proved, through their actions, that the racist stereotypes that had been used to justify their subordinate status were completely false. They were men of depth, education, and humanity, deserving of respect and equality. As we look back on this story from the perspective of many decades later, we can see its enduring relevance. The world continues to struggle with divisions based on race, nationality, religion, and ideology. Propaganda and misinformation continue to spread hatred and fear. Conflicts continue to create enemies out of people who might otherwise have been friends. In this context, the story of Camp Remagen offers both inspiration and instruction. It inspires us by showing what is possible when individuals choose compassion over cruelty, when they refuse to dehumanize others, even when it would be easy or even expected to do so. It shows that transformation is possible, that understanding can overcome prejudice, that enemies can become friends. It reminds us that we all have the capacity for both good and evil, and that our choices matter. It instructs us by demonstrating practical strategies for bridging divides. The soldiers did not lecture the prisoners about why their beliefs were wrong. They did not try to force a change in thinking through punishment or shame. Instead, they simply treated the women with consistent kindness and respect. They shared their culture authentically. They allowed their actions to speak louder than words. They created an environment where the prisoners could question their beliefs safely and come to their own realizations. This approach was far more effective than any amount of argumentation or coercion could have been. The story also teaches us about the power of cultural exchange. Food was the medium through which understanding first began to develop at Camp Remagen. The soldiers shared something deeply personal and important to them, their traditional Sunday dinners, and in doing so, they invited the prisoners into their world. They demonstrated that they had rich traditions, loving families, and sophisticated cultures. They showed that they were not the caricatures of propaganda, but complex, fully realized human beings. This revelation, delivered through the simple act of sharing a meal, had more impact than any formal education program could have achieved. Furthermore, the story illuminates the importance of consistency between values and actions. The soldiers believed in human dignity and respect for all people. They did not just profess these values, they lived them, even when it was difficult, even when the people they were treating with respect had been taught to hate them. This consistency gave their values credibility and power. The women could not dismiss what they were experiencing as mere words or theory. It was real, tangible, undeniable. The legacy of the Sunday dinners at Camp Remagen continues to this day in ways both large and small. The descendants of the soldiers and the prisoners carry forward the lessons learned. Organizations dedicated to reconciliation and peace-building cite the story as an example of effective practice. Teachers use it to help students understand both the dangers of propaganda and the possibilities of redemption. And individuals facing their own situations of conflict or division draw inspiration from the example set by these soldiers and prisoners 3/4 of a century ago. In the end, the story of Camp Remagen is a story about the resilience of human goodness. It is about people who refused to be defined by hatred, who chose a better path even when it was not required of them, who saw the humanity in those they had every reason to hate. It is about the transformative power of kindness, the possibility of change, and the enduring truth that we have more in common than what divides us. The 43 women who entered Camp Remagen in March of 1945 expected brutality. They had been conditioned to fear the worst from the black soldiers who would guard them. What they received instead was compassion, respect, and Sunday soul food dinners prepared with care and shared with generosity. Those meals and the kindness they represented changed the course of these women's lives and rippled outward to affect countless others. They proved that even in the darkest times, even between enemies, human connection is possible. They proved that people can change, that understanding can overcome ignorance, that love can conquer hate. This is the power of choosing kindness over cruelty, of seeing the humanity in everyone, of refusing to let fear and prejudice dictate our actions. This is the legacy of the soldiers of the 684th Battalion and the women of Camp Remagen. May we all learn from their example and strive to embody their values in our own lives and times. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.